The market does not crash like a building collapsing in slow motion. It collapses more like belief, disappearing from a room, quietly, invisibly, and then all at once. On the surface, nothing changes. Buildings still stand. Screens still glow. Contracts still exist. Numbers still appear intact on digital ledgers. And yet, something fundamental has already broken. It always begins the same way. Liquidity tightens. Not as a dramatic announcement, but as a subtle withdrawal. Buyers disappear first, then hesitation enters the system, then silence. And in that silence, the illusion begins to dissolve. Assets that once carried the weight of entire futures suddenly become difficult to sell, not because they are damaged, not because they are gone, but because the system that once agreed they had value is no longer participating. And here is the first contradiction that destabilizes everything. Something can remain exactly the same and still become worthless. This is where the illusion of wealth begins to fracture. Because most people assume value is stored in objects, in houses, in stocks, in bonds, in luxury goods, in financial instruments layered with complexity. But history repeatedly reveals a darker truth. Value is not stored. It is agreed upon, and agreements can vanish faster than objects can decay. A city during financial panic, not destruction, not war, just withdrawal. Banks slow their lending, investors freeze, markets thin out. Suddenly, assets that once represented security become unmoving weight present, visible and completely unusable. A luxury property is still a luxury property, but no one is buying. A stock still exists, but no one is bidding. A bond still pays, but no one trusts the issuer. This is the invisible moment where wealth stops behaving like wealth, and then comes the deeper shock. The more sophisticated the asset, the faster it can collapse in perception. Complex financial instruments, highly leveraged positions, speculative markets, these are not strong during crisis. They are fragile precisely because they depend on uninterrupted belief, and belief is the first thing to vanish under stress. This leads to a disturbing pattern that repeats across history. During economic crashes, entire categories of assets do not slowly decline, they simply lose participation. And when participation disappears, price discovery stops functioning. There is no gradual slope, only a vacuum. This is why the central mystery emerges. How can something that retains its physical or digital form become economically invisible? To answer this, we must confront an uncomfortable idea. Wealth is not what you own. Wealth is what others are willing to continue, recognizing as valuable, and recognition is fragile. This is why economic history is filled with moments where entire populations discover the same truth at once. They were not holding value, they were holding confidence disguised as value. The first curiosity loop appears here. If value depends on collective agreement, then what happens when the collective stops agreeing? The answer is not theoretical, it is historical. It is mechanical, and it is deeply unsettling, because when agreement breaks, the most secure assets often become the most vulnerable. The very things people trust the most are often the first to freeze. This is not failure of the asset, it is failure of the system that breathes life into it. And that system does not break loudly. It withdraws silently until what remains looks identical but no longer behaves the same. This is where the investigation begins. Not with markets, not with numbers, but with history, the archive of repeated financial disillusionments where humanity keeps rediscovering the same truth under different names. History does not repeat itself in events. It repeats itself in conditions. And when those conditions align, credit expansion, overconfidence, liquidity, saturation, the same pattern emerges. Assets that once defined wealth lose their meaning almost instantly. One of the clearest distortions of perceived value. Before the collapse, equity markets represented the future itself: industrial expansion, technological optimism, limitless growth. But when liquidity evaporated, those same equities became illiquid claims on an uncertain future. Prices did not decline gradually. They repriced violently as buyers vanished. Then came another paradox. Even ownership meant nothing without a market willing to recognize it. In post-Soviet transitions, an even more extreme version unfolded. Entire state-owned industries were privatized almost overnight. On paper, immense value was distributed. In reality, without stable institutions, liquidity, and trust, many of these assets collapsed into fractions of their theoretical worth. Ownership existed, but value did not survive the transition of systems. Hyperinflation. Episodes reveal a different dimension of the same phenomenon. When currency itself loses trust, every asset priced in that currency becomes unstable. Real estate, savings, bonds all appear intact while silently disintegrating in purchasing power. In such environments, people rediscover a paradox. The most formal stores of value are often the least reliable under systemic stress, and then there are modern financial crises faster, more synchronized, more global. The 2008 financial shock revealed something deeper. Even highly engineered assets, designed for stability through diversification and mathematical modeling, can fail when correlations converge under stress. The pattern is consistent across time. When confidence breaks, liquidity collapses. When liquidity collapses, prices distort. When prices distort, value becomes a temporary illusion. But there is a deeper contradiction embedded in all of this. In moments of crisis, the most advanced financial systems often produce the most primitive outcomes, barter-like behavior, cash hoarding, and flight into simplicity. Assets that once symbolized sophistication become unusable, not because they are broken, but because the system that interprets them stops functioning. Meanwhile, simple, tangible goods, food, fuel, basic materials often retain or even increase relative value, not because they are inherently superior investments, but because they remain functional outside financial abstraction. This creates a tension that history repeats again and again. The more abstract the asset, the more dependent it is on stable systems. And stable systems are precisely what collapse removes. Every historical cycle reinforces the same hidden structure. Assets do not fail randomly. They fail when the environment that sustains their pricing logic disappears. Yet each generation tends to believe it has escaped the pattern. This time is different, but beneath every era lies the same architecture: trust, liquidity, and belief. And when these three elements weaken simultaneously, the same transformation occurs as value does not disappear. It disconnects from recognition. This leads to a crucial question. If history keeps revealing the same collapse of perceived value, what invisible mechanism governs it? The answer is not in history itself. It is in the structure beneath history. And that structure begins where all markets begin and end, with liquidity, confidence, and connection. Beneath every financial system lies an invisible architecture: three forces that determine whether value exists in a meaningful way or collapses into abstraction: liquidity, confidence, interconnection. These are not separate components. They behave like a single nervous system. Liquidity is the circulation of opportunity. It is the presence of buyers, sellers, and continuous exchange. Without it, prices stop reflecting reality and start reflecting desperation. Confidence is the belief that exchange will continue. It is the psychological foundation that allows participants to act without fear that tomorrow's market will disappear. Interconnection is the structural wiring of global finance. How capital, institutions, and markets are linked across regions and instruments. When all three are stable, assets behave predictably, but when even one fractures, the system begins to distort. And here emerges a paradox that defines modern finance. The more complex an asset becomes, the more it depends on uninterrupted stability. Derivatives, leveraged instruments, synthetic products, these are not inherently fragile in design. They are fragile in dependency. They require continuous confidence, continuous liquidity, continuous participation. Remove any one, and complexity collapses inward. Liquidity is the most misunderstood element. It is not just trading volume, it is psychological availability. It is the willingness of participants to engage at predictable prices. When that willingness disappears, markets do not gently adjust. They gap, they leap downward into voids where buyers no longer exist. This is why crises feel discontinuous. There is no smooth decline, only sudden repricing events, where the system catches up to the absence of participation. And here lies a critical misconception. Risk is not price decline. Risk is market disappearance. An asset can retain theoretical value while becoming practically unreachable. This is the hidden fracture of modern finance. Consider the 5 asset categories that repeatedly struggle in crises. They do not fail because they are poorly constructed. They fail because they depend on continuous market faith. Without it, they become frozen artifacts of a system that is no longer active. The deeper pattern is this: financial systems are not storage systems, they are flow systems. And flow systems collapse when movement stops. What appears stable is often only stable because motion is continuous. But there is another layer beneath this. Synchronization in modern finance, systems are globally interconnected. Banks hold exposure to each other. Funds replicate strategies across borders. Algorithms respond to shared signals. Simultaneously, this means collapse is no longer local. It is transmitted. A disturbance in one region does not remain isolated. It propagates through confidence channels, liquidity channels, and institutional behavior. What begins as a localized stress event becomes a global contraction in participation. And so, the system reveals its deepest vulnerability. It is not built to fail slowly, it is built to fail together. This creates a hidden irony. The same interconnection designed to stabilize markets during growth becomes a transmission network during stress. And when transmission begins, value does not decline evenly, it collapses in clusters. This leads into the next revelation. If the system itself determines how value behaves, then assets are not independent objects of worth. They are expressions of system conditions. And when those conditions shift, assets do not change, their meaning does. In the modern financial world, nothing exists in isolation. Every asset is embedded within a web of exposure, capital flow, and psychological reaction. At first glance, diversification appears to be protection. Spread risk across regions, sectors, instruments and stability increases. But history reveals a paradox. Diversification protects during calm. It synchronizes during crisis. When confidence breaks, institutions do not behave independently, they behave systematically. Risk managers reduce exposure simultaneously. Funds rebalance at the same time. Algorithms respond to identical triggers. Across global markets, the result is not dispersion of risk but concentration of behavior. Assets that were once uncorrelated begin to move together. Not because they are fundamentally similar, but because the same survival logic governs their liquidation. This creates a hidden illusion. It's what appears as a diversified system is actually a synchronized network waiting for shared stress signals. Global capital flows amplify this effect. Money moves instantly across borders, searching for safety. But in doing so, it drains liquidity from multiple regions simultaneously. What looks like protection in one area becomes pressure in another. Banks and institutions act as transmission channels. When they de-risk, they do not selectively unwind exposure. They reduce broad categories of risk at once. This creates cascading effects across asset classes. The emotional illusion here is stability through spread. But beneath the surface, everything is connected through shared dependency on confidence. And here emerges another contradiction. The more globalized finance becomes, the faster local shocks become global reactions. A single stress event does not remain contained. It is interpreted, mirrored, and amplified across interconnected systems. This is why modern crashes feel different from historical ones. They are not isolated collapses. They are synchronized contractions. Yet within this networked structure lies a deeper question. If everything is connected, why do certain assets collapse faster than others? The answer lies in dependency density. Some assets require more continuous participation than others. Some rely more heavily on confidence, liquidity, or leverage cycles. And when global systems contract, those dependencies determine survival speed. This is the hidden selection mechanism of crisis, not strength, not quality, but sensitivity to system withdrawal. This realization leads directly into a deeper inversion. Assets do not fail individually. They fail according to how deeply they are embedded in belief-dependent systems. And this prepares the next revelation, where the entire concept of value itself is flipped. At the core of every financial system lies a hidden truth. Assets do not hold value, they receive it. And what gives them value is not inherent. It is activation through belief. This is where the entire structure flips. In stable environments, complexity is rewarded. Sophisticated instruments, leveraged growth strategies, and abstract financial products are seen as signs of intelligence and efficiency, but in crisis. The same complexity becomes vulnerability, because complexity requires participation, it requires confidence, it requires continuity. And when any of those elements weaken, complexity collapses faster than simplicity. Here lies the paradox. What is most valuable in expansion becomes most fragile in contraction. Value is not stored, is activated. And activation depends entirely on system conditions that are not controlled by the asset itself. When belief is present, assets behave like wealth. When belief disappears, they revert to objects with uncertain meaning. This leads to a disturbing realization. Much of modern wealth exists only under specific psychological conditions. It is conditional wealth, not absolute, not permanent, conditional. This is why crises feel like reality shifts, because they are. The underlying agreement that defines value temporarily dissolves, and in that dissolution, assets do not change, they simply stop being. Interpreted through the same lens, the 5 asset categories that repeatedly fail in crises share a hidden dependency. They require uninterrupted belief in expansion, liquidity, and continuous participation. When that belief breaks, they do not slowly adjust, they deactivate. This is the moment where ownership itself becomes uncertain. Not because possession disappears, but because recognition of possession stops functioning. And here emerges the deepest psychological tension. If value depends on belief, then wealth depends on collective psychology, not individual control, not intrinsic properties, but shared confidence. This is why crashes feel personal, even though they are systemic, because they collapse the shared narrative that defines personal security. What is lost is not just money, it is meaning. And this realization prepares the next stage, a future where these vulnerabilities are not hidden, but accelerated. If history shows repetition, the future shows acceleration. Modern financial systems are not fundamentally different from past systems, but they are faster, more connected, and more automated. This introduces a new paradox. Technological advancement reduces friction in markets, but increases fragility under stress, because speed does not eliminate instability. It compresses it in a highly connected, algorithm-driven financial environment. Liquidity can vanish in seconds rather than days. Capital moves instantly. Risk models react simultaneously. Institutions adjust exposures in synchronized motion. This means that future crises may not resemble slow collapses. They may resemble instantaneous repricing events, where value does not drift downward, but snaps. The emotional tension of this future is acceleration, not just of markets, but of perception. What once unfolded over months may now unfold in moments. This creates a new environment where stability is always temporary, and volatility is always latent. And in this environment, the 5 vulnerable asset categories become even more sensitive, because their survival depends on conditions that may no longer persist long enough to stabilize them. Liquidity becomes more fragile, confidence becomes more reactive, interconnection becomes more instantaneous. This leads to a critical realization. Speed does not change the nature of collapse, it changes its visibility. What was once gradual becomes immediate. What was once predictable becomes sudden, and what was once localized becomes synchronized. The system does not become safer, it becomes faster at revealing its weaknesses. This prepares the final shift. Moving from systems to perception itself, what value truly represents in a world where stability is conditional. At its deepest level, finance is not about money. It is about shared belief systems that assign meaning to abstract structures. Value, then, is not a property of objects. It is a relationship between perception and agreement. This creates a paradox that cannot be resolved, only understood. Value is real enough to shape lives, yet constructed enough to disappear without physical change. In crises, what collapses is not material wealth, but the narrative framework that organizes it. People do not just lose assets, they lose coherence. The story that once made their financial world intelligible stops working. And in that moment, Everything must be reinterpreted. From zero. This is why crashes feel existential. They are not just economic events, they are narrative collapses. Asterisk. They reveal that wealth is not a thing, but a temporary agreement between minds. And when that agreement pauses, reality feels unstable. This leads to a deeper reflection. If value is constructed, then stability is not guaranteed by possession, by collective continuity of belief, and that belief is always fragile. Understanding this does not eliminate risk, but it transforms perception. Assets are no longer seen as fixed containers of value. They are seen as expressions of a living system that can shift at any moment. And this awareness changes everything. Because once value is understood as conditional, certainty becomes impossible, but clarity becomes permanent. In every financial crash, the same truth reappears in different forms. The most dangerous assets are not the ones that lose value slowly. They are the ones that depend entirely on uninterrupted belief. Because when belief stops, they do not decline, they disconnect. What remains is not destruction, but exposure. The exposure of a system that only functioned under agreement. And here lies the final paradox. Ownership feels permanent, but it is only active while systems recognize it. When recognition pauses, ownership becomes theoretical. This is the quiet reality. Beneath every market cycle, wealth does not vanish in crisis. It becomes visible in its conditional nature, and once seen, it cannot be unseen, because what looked like stability was always participation. And participation can always end. The final question is not what survives a crash, but what was ever truly stable to begin with.